And it's my great pleasure to introduce as first speaker Andrew Bumstead. He's a PhD candidate in literature and cultural studies at the University of Utah, as we have just discussed. And his research focuses on the intersection of 19th century children's literature adaptation and media studies. He has published in various important magazines, and he is currently working on his dissertation titled Adapting Childhood, Space of Play in Victorian Children's Literature, and that should be completed in spring 2023. But his talk will not be about Victorian children's literature. It's about something I've actually never heard before until I read that proposal. It's Spoiling Survivor, Edgic, Knowledge Communities, and Narrative Pleasure. Andrew, please.
Okay, thank you. Was I made a co-host so that I could share my screen?
You can share it anyway.
I can share it anyway? Okay, just wanted to make sure. Okay, thank you, everyone. So I'm excited to talk about Survivor. I'm actually a super fan of Survivor, so I don't get to talk about this in an academic setting very often. So this is exciting. So let me know if there's any issues. Does everyone see that? My Zoom screen just disappeared, so let me know.
No, we don't see your presentation.
Do not see it? Okay, no. Hold on. To share. Start share, there we go. Okay, how about that? I'm gonna view slideshow. Let's see. Okay,
that looks good. Great.
Okay, cool. All right, so I'm excited to talk about Survivor. As a super fan, I get excited to talk about it. So basically, I'm going to present on Survivor Edgic, which I will explain, knowledge communities and narrative pleasure. So this project started when I was reading Convergence Culture by Henry Jenkins, and one of his chapters is devoted to the knowledge community formed by the devoted fans of the American TV show Survivor. Survivor first aired in the summer of 2000. I was one of those who watched the first season and have been ever since. And since the first season, fans took to the internet in order to spoil the show. They did this by identifying filming locations through satellite photographs, looking for episode clues frame by frame, and digging for information on cast members in online forums. And Jenkins argues that knowledge communities, which he defines as a community that emerges around the sharing and evaluation of knowledge, he says that they exert greater aggregate power in their negotiations with media producers. And this was clearly the case with Survivor, in which Mark Burnett, the producer of the show, had to plant fake spoilers in order to throw the fans off the scent, so to speak. So the first season, which was not won by Jervis, a fake spoiler was planted that Jervis would win the game, and that deceived many of the fans. And from that point on, a cat and mouse game sort of developed between the producers and the fans of the show. And that game was fun for a lot of viewers who were able to try to figure out what Mark Burnett was planting and what he wasn't planting. And that game pretty much went on until at least season 6, Survivor the Amazon, when an online participant named Chill1 suddenly released information that included, among other crucial spoilers, the identities of the final 2 contestants pictured here. So we have Jenna on the left and Matthew on the right. So although the online Survivor fan community was heavily engaged in a collective search for spoilers, Chill1 did something different. He broke the unspoken rules, and he skipped the steps of the spoiling process. He was vacationing in the Survivor the Amazon area where they were filming. He had a special access to the cast members and to the crew, and he asked some questions and was able to decipher the final 2, and he just dropped that information on the internet. So he spoiled it. He spoiled the game. And as one contestant or one fan said, "We have turned spoiling into a non-cooperative game." He said, "Winning means spoiling the whole season, hiding how you know about it, and making others second guess you all season so you can humiliate them. Chill won and everybody else lost. So what does this really mean about spoiling, right? What do we learn here from spoiling? The idea of spoiling is it's a game. It's a process. It's not just a competitive game of one-upmanship, but it actually is a cooperative game, at least in this Survivor fan community. So why does Chill One matter? Well, according to Pierre Levy, knowledge communities are central to the task of restoring democratic citizenship. And Jenkins argues that Chill One's disruption of this democratic process happened because he dumped information out there without regard to anyone else's preferences. And he says that this holds a deeply totalitarian dimension. So as a result of Chill One's so-called totalitarian disruption, the Survivor spoiler community was forced to redefine its purpose. And nearly 20 years later, we have all these other knowledge communities around the fandom of Survivor. Podcasts such as Rob Has a Podcast in the Tribe, Reddit, Survivor Sucks Forum, cast member pages and Twitter feeds, and Edgic. So I'm going to focus primarily on Edgic, which is a specific fan community created by Survivor fans in order to decode the editing patterns of the show. So Edgic is a portmanteau word of edit and logic. So they look at the edit and they use logic to decode it. And they use primarily 3 criteria: visibility, tone, and rating, in order to decipher the editing patterns of the show. And what's interesting is they don't have special access to spoilers like Chill One did. They're just simply using logic and editing. And so anybody can really join the Edgic community. Any super fan can join. It's open to everyone. So it is democratic in that way. But most fans don't use Edgic. This is a very elite group of super fans, right? They're fans that are very, very engaged in the outcome of the show. So before I get to the definitions of these 3 criteria, I'm going to jump to another controversy that happened in 2016 on Survivor. So similar to the Chill One incident in 2003, this incident happened on Survivor Co Wrong, in which Edgic users correctly predicted the season's winner, Michelle, pictured on the left. Now, this was a surprise to most fans that she won, because most non-Edgic fans were rooting for Aubrey Bracco, the one on the right. And the narrative of this season, the editing patterns that a casual viewer was tuned into, seemed to support the idea that Aubrey was going to win the season. But the Edgic users, they called themselves the Michelle Truthers that season. They correctly predicted that Michelle would win. And so it really spoiled the enjoyment for some of the fans that the Edgic users kept saying, Michelle's going to win, Michelle's going to win. And it sort of ruined their other fans' enjoyment of the show. So at first glance, this controversy seems to be similar to the Chill One incident described by Jenkins, but the difference is that Edgic users did not have, like I said before, special access to spoilers like Chill One did. All they did was they simply cracked the editing code, and they used their collective intelligence to make a correct prediction. The question then is, why is the rest of the community so upset by the Michelle Truthers? So a deeper look into how Edgic users used their knowledge and were able to predict the winner, and how this led to a fracture, speaks to a larger issue of the disruption of narrative pleasure. So first, I'm going to go through the first criteria that Edgic users use. It's the visibility scale. This is the most simple criteria. Basically, it just rates each contestant on a scale of 1 to 5 in each episode. And this is in terms of their visibility, their screen time. So mostly this is confessionals. So this is the one-on-one interviews with the players when they're talking to the camera. That holds the most weight when it comes to visibility, but it could also mean if someone's visible in a group setting or at a challenge or things like that. So visibility is a huge indicator. If a player is only visible on a 1 or 2 scale for most of the season, they're not going to go on to win the season typically. So comparing Aubrey's and Michelle's visibility is really interesting. So Aubrey's the blue line there and Michelle is the green. And these are the different hours of the show on the bottom there. So there's 15 total hours. So Aubrey was mostly pretty visible at the beginning. She had a really big premiere episode, had a lot of attention, really was the focus of the narrative. And that's why a lot of fans really thought she would go on to win, and they were rooting for her. And she was just a very interesting character, a lot of screen time. Michelle, however, was almost invisible, but not quite at the beginning. And then she ended up spiking towards the end. So Edgic users were able to correctly predict that she would go on to win, or at least be a really important contender, by identifying in the first few hours of the show that she was visible even when she didn't need to be visible. And so she wasn't important to the narrative at the beginning of the show, but the editors would highlight her at specific moments to keep her visible, at least somewhat visible, in order to remind the audience of her presence. And so this alerted the Edgic users that something was a little off about her edit. The next criteria is tone. So tone is if a character, a player, is edited as positive or negative. And there's a spectrum here: super positive, positive, neutral, mixed, negative, and super negative. So how this is rated is usually based on what's out of thousands of hours of editing. The editors are very selective in what they choose, right? And so they want to make a character, someone that's going on to win is going to look more positive than someone who loses. But also sometimes people are portrayed as heroic with the music. Sometimes music is a big clue. Sometimes if they're shown bullying or being mean to others, that's going to contribute to a negative edit. So this is really about the content of their edit, and less so about the visibility or amount of content. So an example is with Michelle. Michelle and Aubrey were both portrayed pretty positively over the course of the show. But there's one moment in particular that the Edgic users identified that contributed to the positive edit of Michelle. She was being mansplained to by one of her allies on her tribe. And she spoke to the camera later and said, "I'm a strong, independent woman. I don't need to be carried, bro." Right. And that became a really big catchphrase throughout the season. So that was one of her big moments. It didn't really contribute to the overall arc of the season, but the fact that the editors chose to highlight that moment showed that they were invested in keeping her in a more positive portrayal and a positive tone throughout the season. And then the final criteria is character rating. So character rating is how complex the character is. Are they just stereotypical, or are they more complex? There's a lot of things going into this, but usually it has to do with strategy and emotion. So if a player is if we're shown their strategy and we're shown their way of thinking, they become more complex. We're drawn into their mindset. So they become more complex. But a player could also be invisible. They're just not a presence on the show, really. They could be under the radar, middle of the road, and even OTT, which is over the top. And these are the stereotypical characters that are just really entertaining usually, but really only have one major character trait. Maybe it's bullying the others. Maybe it's being sort of crazy, right? So those over-the-top characters are entertaining, but they don't go on to win the show. So the complex personality is really the sweet spot for the winner contenders. So Aubrey and Michelle both had complex personalities, but Aubrey was really complex. She was shown to be emotional at times. She would talk about her strategy. She was funny. She just had so many different sides to her character that were shown in the edit. So this really misled a lot of non-Edgic users into thinking that she would win because she had such an interesting story. But comparing this is sort of combining all three criteria together: the character rating, the visibility, and the tone. But looking at CP, which is complex personality, we see Michelle here on the first line. She has quite a few complex character ratings, surprisingly. And then on the second line, we have Aubrey, who also has a lot of complex ratings. But the first two episodes are what flagged her as a non-contender for the Edgic users. The first episode here, she had an OTT, so she was over the top. She had a hard time in the game, and so the show portrayed her as very, very emotional, and she was just sort of losing her mind in that first episode, so she became OTT. And in the second episode, she disappeared. She wasn't really shown at all. And then finally got back to CP and then stayed pretty consistent throughout the rest of the season. But those first two episodes really showed the Edgic users that something was off about Aubrey, and maybe she's not the contender that the edit seems to portray her as. So all of these things really contributed to the view that Michelle would win. So all of this, what does this all have to do with narrative pleasure? Mary Beth Harilovich and Michael W. Trossett say that narrative pleasure stems from the desire to know what will happen next, to have that gap between cause and effect opened and closed again and again until the resolution of the story. In Survivor, unpredictability whets the desire to know what happens next, but how that gap will be closed is grounded in uncertainty due to chance. In its invitation to prediction, Survivor is more like a horse race than fiction. So I wanted to push back on this a little bit, this idea that Survivor is just a horse race. I think the Edgic community and many of the fan communities show that Survivor is not just a predicting the winner sort of scenario. It's not just a horse race. And Edgic users specifically show that the process of spoiling is just as important as the outcome. And so my thesis is that spoiling the show is not why fans participate in Edgic communities. Rather, it is the process of assembling and arranging an ordered and linear story out of the show's unpredictable and seemingly random plot structure that gives the viewers a sense of narrative pleasure. So in this case, narrative pleasure does have a combination of these Aristotelian ideas of play. Ludus, which is a combination of Egon and Alia, so chance and competition, and Paideia, which is mimicry, sort of make-believe, and I-links, which is the disorientation of play. All of these ideas of play really combine into the narrative pleasure that the Edgic users engage in with the show. So in conclusion, sort of going back and comparing these two incidents, the Chill 1 incident in 2003 and the Edgic Michelle Truthers incident in 2016. So while it's true that consumers tend to be more actively engaged in playing a game with the producers in the construction of the narrative, as shown by the devoted Survivor fan community, there are various levels to active participation. This leads to a wide variety of knowledge communities, each with its own level of participation, even within a fandom such as Survivor. Edgic users are perhaps one of the most active knowledge communities within the Survivor fandom. And while the unsatisfying conclusion to Survivor go wrong can be linked in part to the limitations of TV storytelling, because ultimately the editors can only use what content they have, right? And they have to try to sell the story. The Michelle Truthers only exacerbated the pushback against Michelle's win by bragging about their prediction all season. And so unlike Chill 1, who threatened the democratic system of the knowledge community by spoiling Survivor the Amazon because of special access to spoilers, the Michelle Truthers didn't spoil it because they didn't have access to true spoilers. But their transgression of the unspoken democratic rules was to leave their own Edgic knowledge community and infiltrate other non-Edgic knowledge communities. So the takeaway here is that in order for democratic citizenship to thrive within knowledge communities, each community must respect the boundaries and preferences of media engagement within other communities. And transgressing those boundaries can jeopardize the narrative pleasure experienced by other communities, and thereby threaten the democratic citizenship of the collective intelligence. All right, thanks.